Trigger warning. This episode covers the subject of child murder and suicide, so listener discretion is advised. According to gov.scot, over the 5-year period between 2016 to 2021, in Scotland, females made up 9% of those accused of homicide, being 35 out of 382 accused, where the case was solved. So female murderers are most definitely in the minority. However, if we go back to 1961 or even 1891, the percentage of homicides by females was much less common, although they still did occur, and I'm going to tell you about 2 of those cases in this episode. Just before 5:30 p.m, 45-year-old James Haming wearily let himself into his ground floor tenement flat in Torry Glen Street in Oaklands in Glasgow, located about 4 miles or 6.4 kilometres south of Glasgow city centre, after a long hard day at work, and made his way into his living room. But before he could sit down, he was stopped in his path by the sound of 2 sickening thumps coming from outside his front window. James quickly made his way to his window and looked out, shocked to see 2 small children lying on the pavement. He rushed outside, briefly thinking that another terrible accident had occurred due to the particular style of defective sash-cord windows that were installed in the tenement building flats, and who a number of adults and children had in the past fallen out of. However, as James made it to the pavement, he heard a noise above him, and as he looked up, he was stunned to see another child falling from a 3rd-storey window, some 40 feet or 12 metres above him. Without thinking, James immediately tried to catch the falling child, only just managing to reach him in time for the child to land awkwardly on James's shoulder before falling to the ground. The thought that this might have been a terrible accident left James then, as he looked up to see a further 2 children falling towards the hard pavement below his window, with James unable to do anything but watch on helplessly. It was early evening on Monday the 27th of March 1961, and 37-year-old Jean Barclay Waddell, who had previously worked as a hotel receptionist and shorthand typist, was walking along the streets of Glasgow, making her way towards her flat in Torry Glen Street. But Jean was not enjoying her walk, and it wasn't to do with the fact it was raining. No, it was because she was extremely anxious, and had the feeling again that she was being watched and followed. Jean's anxiety about continuing to be under surveillance by the police and her fear of being taken back into hospital became so severe that as she passed a gunmaker's, she thought about going in and purchasing an air pistol in order to take her own life. However, having thought about this briefly, decided that it was likely the gunmaker would inform the police of this, and so she continued walking towards her home, when minutes later a new plan entered Jean's head, a plan that would surely see her be hanged. As she grew closer to her flat, and with her plan now fully formed in her mind, with a smile on her lips, Jean approached 2 young children and asked them if they would like to come to her flat and see a litter of puppies she had. Both children agreed and began walking with Jean. The trio soon encountered more young children, and they too were keen to see the puppies, and so joined Jean and the other children. With 6 children now in tow, Jean made her way up the stairs towards her tenement flat. As soon as all 6 children were through Jean's flat door, Jean immediately locked the flat door, grabbed 2 of the smaller children and dragged them towards the window, where she proceeded to open the window and throw both children out, before turning towards the remaining children. With the remaining children now realising just what a dangerous situation they were in, they immediately ran to the flat door to try and escape, only to find it locked. And so they began screaming and banging on the door, desperate for help. Despite residents in the tenement block rushing to help the trapped children, sadly only 1 child was rescued and unharmed physically. While some residents were desperately trying to get into the top floor flat of the tenement to rescue the children, others on the ground witnessing the horrific scene scrambled to call the police and ambulances, still at this point confused as to how so many children could have accidentally fallen from the window. And so it wasn't long before both police and ambulances arrived on the scene, where they were faced with groups of men and women shocked at what had happened, women crying uncontrollably, and the parents of the children now lying crumpled on the pavement being comforted and held back by the police as the ambulance crew tried to do their job for the clearly desperately injured children. However, it quickly became clear that sadly there was nothing that could be done for 1 child, and a blanket was placed over the still body of 4-year-old Marjorie Hughes, with doctors later telling Marjorie's distraught parents that she would have died almost instantly from her injuries. The other children were rushed to nearby Victoria Infirmary before being transferred to the Royal Hospital for Sick Children. Despite the confusion and shocking situation, and according to Glasgow Times on the 20th of August 2023, the police officers at the scene, despite seeing the worst of human nature, found this too much for them to stomach. They quickly established the details, and 37-year-old Jean Barclay Waddell was arrested, although it was reported that the police were shocked to learn that it had been a woman who had been responsible for such atrocity. Jean Barclay Waddell was charged with murdering 4-year-old Marjorie Hughes and for attempting to murder 7-year-old Daniel McNeill, 6-year-old Frank Lennon and his 5-year-old sister Margaret Lennon, and 4-year-old Thomas Devaney, when she appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court the following day. According to the Scotsman, on the 29th of March 1961, she was fresh-faced with her black hair cut short and was wearing a plain fawn coat buttoned to her neck and fur-lined suede boots. She sat in between two policewomen and spoke only once to say, yes, she was the person mentioned in the charges. A trial date was set for the 8th of May, and a police investigation into why such a tragedy had happened was ordered, as well as psychiatrist Dr. Hunter Gillies, who, according to the Edinburgh Evening News on the 8th of May 1961, was a consultant psychiatrist at Stob Hill Hospital in Glasgow, to examine Jean Barclay Waddell and prepare a report for the Procurator Fiscal. As the investigation began and Dr. Gillies began to question Jean Barclay Waddell, it wouldn't be long before a picture began to emerge. It was reported on the 28th of April in the Edinburgh Evening News that Jean Barclay Waddell had again appeared at the Glasgow Sheriff Court, where a plea of insanity had been put forward by her counsel. The paper also reported on the condition of the 4 children who had survived being thrown from the window of Jean Barclay Waddell's top-floor flat. 7-year-old Daniel McNeill, who was the only child still in hospital a month after the attempted murder, was described as doing very well now, but had been described as being seriously ill and requiring an emergency brain operation shortly after the incident. It was reported that while 6-year-old Frank Lennon and his 5-year-old sister Margaret had suffered multiple injuries, they were now fairly comfortable and had been discharged from hospital to continue to recover at home. 4-year-old Thomas Devaney was also said to be comfortable and recovering at home. However, he had suffered a fractured hip. At the trial on the 8th of May 1961, Judge Lord Strachan, after hearing from the defence counsel and from reading Dr. Gillies' report, realised that Jean Barclay Waddell was a deeply troubled individual, and he had no option but to rule that she had been insane at the time of the offence, and to still be, determining her to be unfit to plead and ordering that she be detained at Carstairs Psychiatric Hospital without limit of time. But what had the police investigation and report from Dr. Gillies found out that would have led to such a tragedy taking place, and could it have been avoided? During the Second World War, Jean Barclay Waddell had been married to soldier Floyd Oakman and had relocated to Canada with him. However, before the war ended, Jean developed a severe case of tuberculosis and entered a sanatorium, where she was required to stay for an extended period of time. Sadly, during her stay in the sanatorium, her marriage to Floyd ended, at which point Jean suffered a total mental breakdown. However, continued to be treated in the sanatorium until the 20th of May 1950, when she assaulted a nurse and then was subsequently admitted to Saskatchewan Mental Hospital in Canada. Before being discharged from this hospital on the 14th of February 1951 with a diagnosis, according to the Edinburgh Evening News, of psychosis associated with active pulmonary tuberculosis, Jean had supposedly been suffering from visual and auditory delusions, emotional instability and severe depressive spells, and while in hospital had, according to the Glasgow Times in 2023, received electric shock treatment in an attempt to alleviate these symptoms. Upon being discharged from the Canadian hospital, Jean then travelled back to her hometown of Glasgow, where she worked as a hotel receptionist and a shorthand typist, but would intermittently suffer from delusions and chronic paranoia, believing to be the Empress of Japan on occasions, and on others being convinced she was carrying an illegitimate baby. She also had long-held paranoid beliefs around police officers, believing that they constantly were watching and following her, which was only confounded when, according to the Birmingham Post in May 1961, Jean took to writing letters to several Glasgow newspapers regarding her belief that a property in Glasgow was being used by prostitutes and that these women would shout things at her. These letters were handed to the police, who, upon speaking to Jean and investigating her claims, found no truth in them. At which point, Jean was taken to Hawkhead Mental Hospital in Paisley, where she was diagnosed with and treated for schizophrenia. It is believed that Jean would have been treated with electric shock treatment too during her 6-week stay at Hawkhead Mental Hospital. Having presumably been considered to have responded well to this treatment, after 6 weeks, Jean was released from Hawkhead at the end of January 1961, and she returned once again to her flat, now at Torryglen Street. The decline in Jean's mental health appeared to have happened following her receiving a letter 3 weeks later which advised that she was to return to Hawkhead Mental Hospital for a checkup, a request that terrified Jean as she was sure she was going to be readmitted to the hospital again and she would do anything not to go back there. Her paranoia and anxiety grew to the point that she believed she was again being followed and watched by police, who she believed would at any point be taking her back to hospital against her will. Days before Jean would lure 6 small children to her flat, she took an overdose of 100 aspirins, although immediately afterwards dialed 999 and was taken to hospital. She told Dr. Gillies that she would rather die than go back to a mental hospital, terrified of undergoing shock treatment again, going on to say that this was the reason she lured the children to her flat and threw them out of the window, as she would rather be hanged than go back to Hawkhead Mental Hospital. Dr. Gillies' report concluded, according to the Daily Mirror in May 1961, by saying that Jean seemed more interested in her appeal to men than in her predicament as an accused person. At no time did she express any real sorrow for her actions. Despite Jean's wish to die rather than go back to a mental hospital, by 1961, hanging, especially a female, was no longer something the public wanted, with hanging, according to the Glasgow Times, being suspended in 1965 and abolished in 1969, with Jean instead being sent to Carstairs Mental Hospital, something which she ironically had desperately wanted to avoid. Jean didn't spend her entire life in Carstairs though. She was released and began a new life in Dumfriesshire, about an hour's drive south of her flat in Torryglen Street, where she eventually died at the age of 86 in 2009. So clearly, Jean Barclay Waddell had severe mental health issues, and while I am by no means condoning her murder of Marjorie or her attempting to murder 4 other young children, there were, as far as she was concerned, very real reasons behind why she felt she had to carry out this act. But would the factors that led to the murder in her next story be as clearly understood? The residents of Glasgow had been enjoying a warm summer, and travellers alighting from one of the many trains arriving at Glasgow Queen Street in early August were pleased to feel the heat on their faces instead of rain. However, as they grew closer to the outward luggage cloakroom situated towards the entrance of the station, they were hit by a foul stench. Despite the warm weather, a dark cloud was about to descend over Glasgow. Mary Ann Anderson had had a happy life. She had married a man she loved, who worked as a timekeeper, and they had gone on to have a daughter. The couple lived in a modest 2-bedroom house about a 20-minute walk west of Glasgow city centre, and her husband's income was supplemented by the couple taking in lodgers. The couple's happiness continued when they welcomed their second daughter in 1887. However, tragedy would strike not long after, when Mary Ann's husband sadly died, leaving Mary Ann to take care of their 2 daughters alone. The family continued to stay in their 2-bedroomed home, continuing to take in lodgers. However, after a time, they could no longer afford to stay there, and so had to move to a smaller and cheaper house in Crown Street, located about a 41-minute walk away. Mary Ann continued to care for her daughters, but still grieving the loss of her husband and likely being lonely, she met and took up with a man. It wasn't a serious relationship, and the couple didn't stay together long. However, it was long enough for Mary Ann to discover that she had fallen pregnant, at a time when an illegitimate baby was very much frowned upon. As the pregnancy went on, Mary Ann knew she had to do something, and no longer able to work and look after her children, who were now 7 and 4 years old, she decided the best thing she could do for them was to put them into a home. But what was she to do about the illegitimate child she soon would be giving birth to? With the foul stench coming from the outward luggage cloakroom becoming so severe, on Thursday the 6th of August 1891, the decision had been made to open it, after it had been determined that the contents of the locker had been dropped off on Tuesday the 21st of July by a female giving the name of Mackenzie. The man in charge on that day could offer no further information, as that particular day had been exceptionally busy, given it was Fair Tuesday, and over 1,000 parcels had passed through his hands. Upon the locker door being opened, the smell intensified, and a small box was found inside. The box was opened, and the contents shocked everyone. Inside, wrapped in a newspaper, a towel, and a piece of flannel, was the body of a baby, estimated at that time to have been less than 6 months old, although upon a post-mortem being carried out, it revealed that the female child had been no more than 4 days old and had been born alive. The post-mortem also revealed, according to the Renfrewshire Independent on the 28th of August 1891, that the baby had met its death by violence, with there being indications that its chest had been severely crushed, as if jumped upon. Upon the shocking discovery, the police were called, and Detective Inspector Carmichael and Sub-Inspector Elliot soon arrived on the scene. However, there was very little evidence for them to work with, other than finding out from the cloakroom attendant that the box had been dropped off by a woman calling herself Mackenzie, although it was quickly established that this was likely a false name. The detectives therefore made a city-wide appeal for anyone with any information to please come forward, as nobody, least of all the detectives, would want a case such as this to remain unsolved. But as the days went by, it looked exactly like this was going to be the outcome. However, due to the detectives' determination, it was decided to release a detailed description of the flannel the baby's body was found wrapped in, and it was the right decision, as thanks to this, on the 17th of August, 11 days after the baby's body had been found, detectives received information which would ultimately lead to the culprit. A midwife came forward as she had recognised the description of the flannel that the detectives had released as being very like the one she had given to one of her patients very recently. The midwife told detectives that on the 17th of July, she had attended a home in Crown Street where she had delivered an illegitimate child. Whilst attending to the mother after the birth, the mother disclosed that she was going to take the child to her aunt's and that she herself really wanted to work in service again. Before the midwife left, the mother asked her if she had something she could wrap the baby in to keep it warm while going to her aunt's, to which the midwife then wrapped the baby in a distinctive flannel that she had. The very flannel that the detectives had given the detailed description of to the public. Following receiving this information, the detectives were quick to make inquiries in Crown Street, where they discovered, according to the Renfrewshire Independent, that a pregnant woman had indeed rented a house from the beginning of May until the day of the box being left at Glasgow Queen Street, that she had in fact given birth to a daughter shortly before leaving, and that her name was Mary Ann Anderson. It was also discovered that a few days after giving birth, Mary Ann Anderson had sold all of her belongings and then disappeared. Deciding to follow up on the fact that the midwife had said that Mary Ann had expressed a desire to go into service, detectives began the task of visiting registry offices in the city that recorded the information of those who had gone into service and where. And as luck would have it, on the second registry office they visited, they discovered that indeed Mary Ann Anderson had gone into service and had secured a position in a house in Kelvinside, about 2 miles or 3 kilometres northwest of the city. On Wednesday the 26th of August 1891, 20 days after the body of Mary Ann's child had been found at Glasgow Queen Street, detectives arrived at the house in Kelvinside where Mary Ann was now working. And upon them knocking on the door, it was answered by none other than Mary Ann Anderson herself. When they told her why they were there, she looked dejected and simply said, "I expected you. No one should do evil that good may come of it." 32-year-old Mary Ann Anderson was arrested and transported to Central Police Chambers before she appeared before the sheriff the next day on a charge of causing the death of her 5-day-old child, where, according to the Renfrewshire Independent, she looked downcast and melancholy, and when questioned as to the crime and her motive, she burst into tears and said, according to the Glasgow Evening News, that she had killed her illegitimate baby as she did not wish the stigma of having an illegitimate child grow up with her daughters, to whom it would have been a disgrace. It's not known what happened to Mary Ann Anderson after this, but presumably she was sentenced for this crime and detained either in prison or in a psychiatric hospital. So, do you think the factors that led to Mary Ann killing her illegitimate baby were clearly understood?
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.